Today's exposition comes from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, which reads, I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called. The word therefore marks a transition from the first half of this epistle to the second half. In the previous 3 chapters, Paul unpacked doctrine that was in itself edifying and soul nourishing, but that doctrine also laid a foundation for the forthcoming practical application. It's important to remember that sound doctrine renews the mind, but it also shapes a person's life. Orthodoxy should lead to orthopraxy. Sound doctrine should lead to sound living. Knowing God's truth should lead to walking in God's truth. Now, Paul has done this kind of thing before. In his epistle to the Church of Rome, he spent essentially 11 chapters unpacking glorious doctrine before the therefore of Romans chapter 12, verse 1, where he besought and entreated the Romans to offer up their bodies as living sacrifices to God. Now, what might take the reader by surprise is that the doctrine that he has unpacked previously in this epistle leads to practical application, yes, for personal purity, but even more immediately, unity within the local church. Well, back to the text. Notice how Paul identifies himself as the prisoner of the Lord. Now, he has identified himself as the prisoner of the Lord earlier in this epistle in chapter 3, verse 1. So then, why is he doing it again here? Why is he identifying himself as a prisoner of the Lord, or more literally, prisoner in the Lord again here? Well, we're not told explicitly, but 2 ideas come to mind. Number 1, ultimately, Paul knew that he wasn't a prisoner of Rome. He knew that in God's sovereignty, this was God's design for him. He was more Jesus' prisoner than he was Caesar's prisoner. And secondly, this identification would provide an appropriate preface for the forthcoming imperatives. His union with Christ and faithfulness to his calling in Christ came with a cost: chains. So as the Ephesians heard or read the forthcoming imperatives, they would know that there was a cost that was worth embracing for the sake of Christ. Well then, how did Paul begin this transition from indicatives to imperatives? Well, we see he wrote, I beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called. Now, the word beseech can have different shades of meaning depending on the context. Here, it clearly has the idea of Paul coming alongside of the Ephesians and exhorting them. The word walk is synonymous for the conduct of one's life. So Paul is exhorting the Ephesians to live lives worthy of the calling they received. Now, Paul has used the word worthy in this kind of way before. He exhorted the Philippians that their conduct would be worthy of the gospel. He told the church of Colossae that he was praying that they would walk worthy of the Lord. He exhorted the Thessalonians to walk worthy of God. Now, when Paul uses worthy in this kind of way, it is akin to befitting. So note, Paul was not telling the Ephesians to walk worthy enough to be called. Rather, he was telling them to walk in such a way that befitted their calling. They had been called by the grace of God, and now they were to live lives that properly corresponded to and correlated with their callings in Christ. And if you are a Christian, you have been effectually called to life in Christ. May you live worthy of that calling, living a life that befits it. And if you're wondering, well, what does that actually look like for me? You could go ahead in Ephesians chapter 4, 5, and 6 and see how Paul instructed the Ephesians and you and I. It would look like being a means to preserving unity in the local church as opposed to fanning flames of division. It would look like stewarding your spiritual gift as opposed to burying it. It would look like putting off the old man and his ways and putting on the new man and his ways. It would look like walking in love and in purity and in wisdom in your family relationships and in all the different spheres of your life. It would look like putting on the full armor of God as you engage in spiritual warfare for the sake of the gospel.